Civil Rights Movement, 1955 to 1965. The Civil Rights Movement was a struggle for social injustice for African Americans in America in the 1950s and 60s. The catalyst of the movement was the reactions of the Black community to the unjust murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till in 1955. He allegedly wolf-whistled at Carolyn Bryant. Her husband and half-brother then brutally beat and mutilated him, shot and left his body in the Tallahatchie River. Till's mother insisted on an open casket for thousands of people to witness her son's mutilation at the hands of a white man. It was later disclosed that Carolyn Bryant had fabricated her story. Later this year, the Interstate Commerce Commission decided in NAACP that separate waiting rooms in train stations violates the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. Another very important event marked this year when Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus, which resulted in her arrest, as well as the Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. asked for a first-come, first-served basis, with the African Americans being seated from the back and the whites being seated from the front. In 1956, there were plenty of countermeasures taking place to support the continuance of segregation. 19 senators and 77 representatives signed the Southern Manifesto explaining how they will use every congressional method to fight the implementation of the Brown versus the Board decision. President Eisenhower worked to defeat segregation in federal facilities, but refrained from endorsing the Brown decision because he considered it a setback in progress in the South by at least 15 years. In 1957, in Little Rock, Arkansas, 9 African American students attempted to attend the high school. Governor Faubus of Arkansas called out the National Guard to prevent the integration. In return, Eisenhower sent 1,000 paratroopers to ensure the rights of the Little Rock Nine to attend the high school. Eisenhower also proposed a general civil rights legislation that provided federal efforts aimed at securing and protecting the right to vote. During this year, Martin Luther King Jr. founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, or the SCLC, to direct the crusade against desegregation. King's platform encouraged nonviolent protests through Christian love, and also in order to appeal to middle-class white America. In response to King's ideas, another spontaneous event was sparked from the passive resistance movement. In 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, 4 African American students from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College sat down at a lunch counter and were denied service. These 4 students refused to move, just as Rosa Parks did. This sparked similar sit-ins across the South, as well as kneel-ins in churches. Now we can see where Colin Kaepernick got the idea from. These peaceful protests led to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with their tactic of direct, though peaceful confrontation, replaced the NAACP and its reliance on court action in the forefront of the civil rights movement. This change would eventually lead to the success of the movement. In 1961, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, sponsored a freedom ride where biracial groups tested a Supreme Court decision outlawing segregation in all bus and train stations used in interstate commerce. In 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. began a massive protest in Birmingham, Alabama, one of the South's most segregated cities. Despite pleas from the government to stop protests, on August 28th, more than 200,000 marchers gathered in the March on Washington for a day-long rally in front of the Lincoln Memorial. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bars discrimination in public accommodations and strengthens the right to vote. During this year, Martin Luther King Jr. is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. 1965 marked the year that Malcolm X was assassinated, but also the year that President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. This act banned literacy tests in states and counties in which less than half the population had voted in 1964 and provided for federal registrars in these areas to assure African Americans the franchise. In less than a year, 166,000 African Americans were added to the voting rolls in Alabama.